All right, let's finish up by looking at trust busting. Big question we're trying to answer is how the US government finally attempted some economic reforms after looking at many of the problems exposed by the Gilded Age. So, first, we just have to talk about what a trust is. A trust is a simple word for a monopoly. And at the turn of the 20th century, the United States saw a massive consolidation of companies. There were over 4,000 different companies by 1897, and by 1904, that had consolidated all the way down to 257. So the federal government does start to act before the traditional progressive era to take on some of the trusts. So they start really with the railroads. In 1887, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act that was signed into law by Grover Cleveland. And that created a bureaucratic agency called the Interstate Commerce Commission that regulated interstate trade. So, again, they really were looking at controlling railroad prices. Railroads, there were only a handful of them, so they essentially acted as monopolies in their region. So, that's a great example of an early progressive antitrust type policy. Then in 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act that was signed into law by President Benjamin Harrison. That was an attempt to limit the power of monopolies, but it was very poorly written and not very heavily enforced. Teddy Roosevelt, when he became president in 1901, did label himself as a trust buster. And he filed over 40 antitrust lawsuits under the umbrella guidance of the Sherman Antitrust Act. So basically, what set Teddy Roosevelt apart from previous presidents was he went through the court system and used the power of the Sherman Antitrust Act, as vague as that act was, to start breaking up monopolies. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was not antitrust all over the board. He wanted to play the role of mediating disputes between labor unions and large corporations. He very clearly saw certain trusts as being good, certain trusts that were innovative for the economy, that created jobs, that helped contribute to the country's growth. But then there were other trusts that he labeled as bad trusts, trusts that did need to be regulated or even taken down by government intervention. Again, like I was saying previously, the Sherman Antitrust Act was so vaguely worded that it was occasionally manipulated in the court system to limit the power of labor unions because they were gaining strength at the time. So you could actually see the trusts, the corporations themselves, using the language of this law to do something exactly counter to what its intent was. Again, when Teddy Roosevelt was president, he continues this trust busting pattern and really takes ownership of it. So typically when we're studying US history, we don't really think of presidents prior to Teddy Roosevelt as ones that were willing to take on trusts. So Roosevelt worked to break up the Northern Securities Company, which was a railroad monopoly. And this action was upheld ultimately by the Supreme Court. I forget if I mentioned some numbers. He broke up approximately 40 other large corporations during his presidency. I already touched upon his distinction between good and bad trusts. I suppose what's just interesting about that is that he did believe that good trusts also could regulate themselves, that they could keep their prices low and they could ensure that they were undertaking good business practices. And he believed that bad trusts were the ones that stifle competition and were bad for the economy. So he believed essentially that trusts were only bad if they bullied smaller businesses and just destroyed all of the competition. So it's very difficult to really determine what trust does that and what trust doesn't. As far as railroad regulation is concerned, I already touched upon the ICC, so let's think about how that builds. There were two laws passed during the Roosevelt administration that strengthened the regulatory powers of the Interstate Commerce Commission. So first there was the Elkins Act of 1903 that had greater authority to stop railroads from granting rebates to favored customers, and it imposed fines on railroads that granted these rebates. So railroads no longer under the Elkins Act were able to sort of give their favorite interested parties special privileges. Then in 1906, Congress passed the Hepburn Act, and that said that the Interstate Commerce Commission could fix just and reasonable rates for railroads. So essentially, that was an example of government contributing to setting prices, and it also discontinued free passes for loyal shippers. So again, that sense of favoritism was something the government was going after. After Teddy Roosevelt's second term, he hand-selected William Howard Taft to be his successor, who won election as a Republican in 1908. And Taft was progressive in some ways. He supported some of the same reforms as Teddy Roosevelt, and he also alienated many progressives. So one big significant example of Taft being a progressive was that he took on Carnegie Steel, which was one of the most well-known and powerful corporations at the time. And Andrew Carnegie, in many ways, was seen as untouchable given his significant philanthropic efforts. Taft was more of a trust buster than Teddy Roosevelt if we're just talking about numbers. Taft prosecuted about twice the number of antitrust cases as Roosevelt. And Taft also signed the Elkins Act into law in 1910. And what that did was that allowed the Interstate Commerce Commission to suspend new railroad rates, oversee telephone and telegraph and cable companies, so even more government intervention. It's really expanding the powers of the ICC to beyond just railroads. And by the time the 1912 election rolled around, trusts were essentially the major issue of that entire campaign. So there were 4 significant candidates to talk about in this election. You had Taft running for re-election as the Republican, and then you had Teddy Roosevelt come back. Teddy Roosevelt was dissatisfied with the type of progressive job that Taft was doing, and so he decided to run as a progressive candidate. And he nicknamed his party the Bull Moose Party, given the strength of the progressive reforms that he planned to undertake. Then you had Woodrow Wilson as the Democratic candidate, who called for a new freedom platform, which wanted little government intervention in the economy. And then to the far left, you had the socialist candidate, Eugene V. Debs. And that's significant, even though Debs did not win any electoral votes. His progressive platform did push both Roosevelt and Wilson farther to the left. And Wilson ended up winning 42% of the popular vote, but that still was enough to take the Electoral College. And once Woodrow Wilson was elected, he ends up supporting an antitrust agenda anyway. So it's interesting how his New Freedom agenda, which called for little federal government intervention, actually panned out. So Wilson continued many of Teddy Roosevelt's traditions. He supported an activist government, and he advocated for the breakup of all trusts and large corporations that dominated markets. So Wilson actually believed that this policy of breaking up trust would create competitive markets where no trust was dominant over any other corporation, and that would make it less likely for the government to have to intervene. And so that's Wilson's vision of the New Freedom platform, right? Destroy the trust first, and then you don't need to regulate them. Wilson took on what he called the triple wall of privilege. So he was taking on tariffs, banking, and trusts. He wanted tariffs to be lower. So Congress pushed through a graduated income tax, which later the states ratified in the form of the 16th Amendment. Also, Congress restructured the banking and currency system under the Federal Reserve Act, which creates the Federal Reserve, a huge, huge agency to control things like interest rates. And so this gives the federal government more control over the country's credit system as well, to try to make that more stable. Also, during the Wilson administration, there was an expanded antitrust authority. The Federal Trade Commission, another bureaucratic agency, was created, and that gave the federal government more control over corporations. Now, Wilson was not progressive, particularly when it came to social reforms. One exception to that was the Keating-Owen Act, which limited child labor. But Wilson was a very openly known segregationist, a racist. He segregated the White House staff. He very much was supported by the Jim Crow segregationists of the Democratic Party in the South. So if we're thinking about the types of progressive platforms that we discussed in previous videos in this unit, things like labor unions, right, and anything remoted to racial justice, Wilson was not willing to take that on by any means. One big problem with the New Freedom Democratic Party in general, this support for smaller governments and Wilson's plan to attack this triple wall of privilege, it couldn't be accomplished without increasing the powers of the federal government. So it was sort of a contradictory plan. So, like I was saying with some of the previous examples, even though Woodrow Wilson out loud said he wanted the government to intervene in the economy less in order to accomplish all these plans, a whole bunch of new bureaucratic agencies are created, new taxation is introduced. Really, what we see is more government intervention, just in a different form and under a different party. Last thing to mention during the Wilson administration is the Clayton Antitrust Act. So that was passed by Congress and signed into law in 1914. And what that did was that strengthened the old 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act. It was anti-monopoly and it forbade price discrimination, which essentially was where corporations would issue different prices for different people, different customers. We saw that with railroads prior to things like the ICC, where railroad companies would charge one client a preferable price, especially if they did favorable business with them. And the Clayton Antitrust Act also helped labor unions, which were exempted from being prosecuted as trusts. So that ambiguity that we saw with the Sherman Act that actually punished unions, that is taken away. So courts could not use all those old antitrust acts to break up strikes, such as the Pullman strike. So in conclusion, I know we talked about these previous three questions in the last video that we did where we looked at women in the progressive movement. And I know it's been a minute since I recorded this video. It's been about 2 weeks, but we finally touched upon this question here, looking at how the US government was reforming the economy during the progressive era. So hope this was helpful towards your understanding. We're going to get a little bit more into the progressive era in the next video with environmental reform, and also we'll return to an examination of Jim Crow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.